Hey guys, Drifter here. Today I've got a video for you about women in World War II, both in Call of Duty World War II the game, and we're going to take a historical look at the roles that women played in actual World War II. So this is going to be part gameplay commentary, part history, and part opinion as well. I got this topic from my Twitter feed, from Reddit, from Charlie Intel, from just about every single type of social media that I engage in. There were a lot of people that were very upset about the female players in World War II, and if you haven't heard, yes, female soldiers are confirmed to be in multiplayer for World War II. You can choose either male or female. And also wanted to say thanks to One Boom for the video idea, and because I more or less shamelessly stole his thumbnail, but with permission. His channel is linked down there in the description. However, in case you didn't see it, Michael Condrey himself put on Twitter that yes, there will be female French Resistance players in multiplayer. You can see it right here. Ryan says, "Hi, I'm very excited about World War II. Question, will there also be female characters for multiplayer? My wife is concerned." Michael Condrey says, "Yes, for sure," very excitedly. And then it doesn't take very long before this to kind of derail. We have a, "That's fucking BS. It's 2017, bud. If they didn't have females, all game news would talk about is how they are bad for the industry and how the game news make bank. I'm tired of everybody caving to all these SJW. Wow, I'm not buying this anymore. Either remove the females or you'll lose tons of fans and money." Ooh, man, that was a pretty fun Twitter read right there. Let's move over to Reddit and see how things are doing on Reddit. Tips Fedora to my lady. "I don't really care that they're in multiplayer. It's why they're in it that irks me. It's all about political correctness and equality and giving into these stupid agendas posed by feminists. It's the same with the Star Wars franchise since being purchased by Disney with all these female leads in the movies and games. It's all done to please the easily offended and not about what actually works best." As you can see, the gaming community is responding with their normal amount of wisdom, consideration, and care, and everything's going fantastic. Despite the strange grumps here about snowflakes and social justice and feminists and whatnot, there is a sizable community that does have a valid concern, and that's about historical accuracy and relevance. Mostly in that if you give Sledgehammer an inch, they'll take a mile. If you say, okay, it's not so bad that we have women in multiplayer, then they'll be like, well, let's add pink camos, and let's add gun bling, and let's have people dance and dab, and oh, you can wear sunglasses now, and here's your zebra hat, and this kind of crazy stuff. So the community is in this sort of area where they don't want to give in to one single inch of goofy cosmetics, because Sledgehammer is kind of the king of that. They really did that with Advanced Warfare a lot, and the other Call of Duty games have been getting increasingly silly. Now, when we're out in outer space, and in modern times, it's totally okay to have your crazy camos, but in the historical context, not so much. Personally, I think camos are fine, but a lot of the more decorative body items just get very, very strange. But moving on from this little bit of craziness, I wanted to talk about the role of women in World War II. And before we get too deep into that, I know 99% of the fighting was men. 99.99999, however percentage of it was men. It was almost entirely men fighting and dying in World War II, except for the poor women that just got massacred in the little villages and stuff. But I do want to talk about how women served in World War II. Now, most of you are familiar with the fact that women had to work at home, building ships, boats, ammunition. They had to do the jobs that men couldn't do because they were off fighting. You've all seen Rosie the Riveter, we can do it, let's roll up our sleeves, we can do a man's job and work and that kind of thing. And that's what the vast majority of women did in World War II. They did almost every single job that a man would have or could have done because they weren't there and they weren't doing them because they were off overseas fighting and killing each other. And coincidentally, this is one of the primary reasons for the rise of female empowerment and feminist movements and overall demographic shifts in the West, is because that so many men died, some of the women had to keep the jobs, and even when the men came back home, the women had some degree of power and education and employment, and they didn't want to change, and this was like a big shift in a completely different direction. These weren't just menial labor jobs. You had women doing hard construction, building all of the tools necessary for war. They would build the interiors of almost every single vehicle, and some women even worked on the engines themselves. Moving on from that, some women served in auxiliary units in World War II that trained or prepared for war but did not deploy. Here's an image of Chinese women training to fight in China's army, fearing an increasing Japanese invasion. Now, these women never fought, but they did train to fight. You'll see a similar story for the Finnish female paramilitary. Women learned how to fly, they learned how to shoot, and not all of the auxiliary was training and not fighting. Some of them did do, we'll say, intelligence work. They would work the phone, work the radio. They would use telescopic lenses or just the radar to spot enemies and make call-outs and make reports. And some of them also ran emergency response teams, like this group of women here fighting fires at Pearl Harbor in 1941. And that group just about couldn't be any more diverse. Looking at it from today's standpoint, it seems like the most perfect photo opportunity I've ever seen in my entire life. However, a rare few women did see combat, and I do want to point out that they were rare, not nearly as rare as World War I, mind you, but they did see combat. Women were supposedly emancipated in Soviet Russia or the Soviet Union, so they could enlist and they could have and hold any job that a man could, but this was more in name only. In reality, the Soviet women that enlisted were treated poorly. They struggled for equality. Other officers did not treat the female officers kindly, and they didn't have a lot of good places. But Russia did take women, and they did train them, mostly near the end of the war when they were quite literally running low on manpower, pun intended. And the Soviets found that women worked best in sniper teams, so most of the women that were trained worked as snipers or as sort of a secondary support to the front lines. Now, the female Soviet sniper teams performed admirably in combat. A lot of stories about them killing hundreds, or some of them, I should say. There's also the infamous Russian Night Witches, their female bombing squad. These were a squad of all-female pilots that would do bombing raids on Germany. They kind of gave them some not-so-great missions, but they managed to do it anyway. And women did fight on the front lines with Russia, on the ground with men, although infrequently. It was a thing, and it did happen. Also read a story about a Russian tank commander that was female. Her fiance got killed by the Germans, so she wanted to volunteer and was denied, so she got angry and wrote a letter to Stalin, who very uncharacteristically answered this letter and granted her permission to train to be a tanker. She completed the training and then went into war and killed like 100 people before they finally cut her down. Very, very nasty lady. The other women that saw frontline combat were resistance fighters, which is what they've mostly been talking about in Call of Duty, tying it back to the game. Now, some of the countries that got hit the hardest were finding themselves running low on manpower, so the Italian, Greek, and Yugoslavian resistances regularly had women in combat roles. Now, these were resistance, these were guerrilla fighters, this was hit and run, this was ambushes, this is not marching down and just hosing everybody like in ancient wars, but these women, pictured here, are the anti-fascist fighters from Italy, and they did actually see combat. I think they're trying to look nice for the photos right there. But what we talk about in game mostly is the French resistance, the female French resistance fighters. Now, historically speaking, there were a lot of women in the French resistance, though very few of them actually saw combat. Most of them held secondary positions of power or management in that they didn't run the group, but they would sort of manage the group, or they would work on some things for the group. They'd be treasurer, they would relay information, they'd do a lot of different things. But some of them did see combat, like the woman pictured here. But the one that I want to talk about that kind of impressed me when I was doing my research is this particular lady called Nancy Wake. She was an ambulance driver in France. And when the war broke out and France got overrun, she used almost all of her husband's wealth, which they managed to maintain somehow, running a sort of underground hospital and ally smuggling operation. So they would heal wounded soldiers, they would smuggle VIPs, they would smuggle information, and they completely exhausted their wealth, the husband and the wife. The wife was eventually caught, tortured, but escaped to Britain. She volunteered for British espionage, paradropped back into France sometime later, got back into the resistance, and ended up becoming the leader of a 7,000 person resistance unit. Now, I would say unit loosely. They're kind of like the insurgents we fight in Iraq and Afghanistan. They sort of very loosely work together. And she actually conducted combat raids herself and is credited with killing an SS officer in hand-to-hand combat near the end of one of the raids. That's a historical fact. You can go Google it and look it up. So let's go back to video games and my opinion. So would it be historically accurate to have female soldiers? The answer is yes, but only if you were depicting a rare event. They were like unicorns on the battlefield. There were very, very, very few female soldiers. The vast majority of enlisted men didn't even see a female soldier. So if this were supposed to be an everyday in the war, absolutely not. If it were a special event, then yes, that might make sense. Now, many players believe that this is a small step toward the rainbow zebra camos, toward adding like gun bling, toward your green and purple helmets and dabbing and dancing and that sort of stuff, which I personally do not want to see in World War II. If we're going to have cosmetics, which almost certainly are because it's Call of Duty, it needs to somewhat be in era. But again, the attitude is that if you give them an inch, they'll take a mile. If we give in on this one thing, then the whole game might be ruined because Sledgehammer will take off and run with it. And I kind of agree with them on that front. But from a user standpoint, adding some female players doesn't really hurt anything, because believe it or not, a surprising amount of women play video games these days, even Call of Duty. If you look at the create a class for any major video game currently out there, you will see that you have an option to make a female character. This has been included in Call of Duty ever since CoD Ghost. You could play as the character that was modeled after Tina, but it's a thing that's done to appeal to a significantly larger portion of the player base than you would think. So it's there for a reason, and I think that as long as the multiplayer stays World War II themed, if we keep our female soldiers but keep them historically accurate, and it doesn't go full-on nutty with jetpacks and lasers and all this kind of crazy stuff, then it should be okay. Personally, I find all of this amusing, that people get so upset about female soldiers and historical accuracy, but are not nearly as concerned about magical zombies and wizardry, because it's the alt mode, it's the sci-fi mode, it's supposed to be that way. Guys, that's all for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something useful. If you did, don't forget to like, favorite, and subscribe. Drifter out.